For our second presenter this afternoon, we have Jim Belcher. Dr. Belcher is a founding church planner and lead pastor at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Newport Beach, California, but now he serves as the chairman of the Practical Theology Department and head of the D-Min program at Knox Theological Seminary. He holds a PhD in political philosophy from Georgetown, and like Dr. Larson, is the author of an IVP book, Deep Church, which you can find on the book tables out in the hallway. The paper he's presenting this afternoon is an adaptation of a chapter that he is preparing for a new book, also to be published by University Press, to be entitled Deep Christianity. And contrary to what you might have found in your program, the title of his talk, of his paper this afternoon, is The Secret of Finkenwalde, Liturgical Treason. Let's welcome Jim Belcher.
I feel like after Professor Larson's talk that I almost have to come clean. I'm an evangelical, Presbyterian, and I'm a pastor. And one of my favorite books is Life Together. Second, Cost of Discipleship. So now you have it all. You know where I'm coming from. It's great to be here. I'm thankful to Wheaton. I'm thankful to University Press for inviting me. It's a thrill to be here with so many scholars. I am not a Bonhoeffer scholar. I've never formally studied him or wrote on him. I have come to a love of him through his writings, particularly as a pastor myself, and have used his books for many, many years, both in sermon preparation and also in inspiring my people and my congregation to love community and love the church and those sorts of things. After almost 18 years of pastoring, my family and I took a year off. We called it a furlough and spent a year traveling around England and Europe. And part of that was to make a Bonhoeffer pilgrimage to introduce my children to a man who's had a profound impact on me. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I am now, as of January, the beginning of January, a professor down in South Florida teaching practical theology, and I use Dietrich Bonhoeffer, particularly Life Together, in my Ministry of the Church class. Matter of fact, on Wednesday, in our 3-hour class, we spent the entire time talking about Life Together. I also have, based on what you're going to hear in this talk, have rethought the way I teach, the way I think about the Christian life and building community. And maybe in the Q&A we can talk about it more, but I have integrated some of the things that I've learned here into the way we do class, particularly spending almost the first half hour in liturgical prayer, singing, intercession for one another, and those sorts of things. So I will begin. On the morning of July 21st, 1943, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, along with other prisoners in the Tegel prison sickbay, were listening to the radio when he heard that the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, had failed the previous day. Although the briefcase bomb had exploded near Hitler's feet in the secret wolf lair in East Prussia, killing a number of high-ranking officials, amazingly, Hitler survived, spared by the strange design of the thick wooden table that blocked most of the blast. Hitler was stunned but ecstatic that he had survived, crediting divine providence. No sooner was he done celebrating than he began rounding up, torturing for information, and executing those involved. Colonel von Stauffenberg, the man who planted the bomb, a devout Catholic, motivated in part to kill Hitler by his faith, shouted just before he was executed, "Long live sacred Germany." While Bonhoeffer was not involved in the July 20th plot, he knew about it and waited anxiously for its success. Its failure was bad news not only for Germany, but also for his 16-month-old case that was awaiting trial. Now everyone who had given him cover was either in prison themselves or they were dead. But it got worse. In September, the Gestapo discovered the secret chronicles of shame, the Zossen files, kept by his brother-in-law Hans von Danyani, detailing the history of Nazi atrocities in the two failed assassination plots of March 1943. The files contained Bonhoeffer's name, along with much else incriminating evidence, proving for the first time his direct involvement in the plots. He could no longer deny his role or his association with the conspirators. The discovery dashed any hope of release from prison. His fear of torture must have returned at this point, and he may have even considered suicide. But instead, he decided to escape. Corporal Knobloch, his favorite guard, agreed to help. The plan was for Dietrich to dress in a mechanic's suit and simply walk out of the prison with Knobloch at the end of the day. From there, he would go into hiding and then would leave the country as soon as possible. On September 24th, Bonhoeffer's sister Ursula and her husband delivered to Knobloch's home a package with the mechanic's suit and some money. A false passport and a flight to Switzerland were also arranged. The plan was now in motion. But then something unexpected happened, an event that would force him deeper into the moral crucible of decision than he had ever been before. On an overcast, cool, drizzly day in early April 2011, we arrived at Marienburger Allee 43, located in the leafy Charlottenburg section of Berlin, an upper middle-class neighborhood of two-storied, well-manicured homes. The house, built by Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer in 1935 for the retirement, contained an attic room built for Dietrich whenever he was in Berlin. Knut Hammerling, a graduate student living at the house, greeted us at the door. Small in stature with thinning brown hair, dressed in jeans and a plaid button-down shirt, he wore wire-rimmed glasses. "Welcome to the Bonhoeffer house," he said warmly in fluent English with a strong German accent. With my wife, Michelle, and our 4 children, I had scheduled an appointment to see the house, in part to relive the moments in the movie Bonhoeffer, Agent of Grace, that my kids had seen just a few days before. We were in Berlin as part of an 11th-month tour of England and Europe. We were calling it a year of pilgrimage, a year of homeschooling abroad, and Berlin was one of our stops. Pointing out each room on the ground floor, Knut began telling us about that fateful day on April 5th, 1943. Bonhoeffer had returned home around noon with the 2 failed assassination attempts from the previous month on his mind. Bonhoeffer must have been anxious for word. Had the plots been discovered? Would he be implicated? He needed to talk with his brother-in-law, Hans von Danyani, to get an update. Danyani, who was married to Dietrich's sister, Christine, was well connected, continued Knut, to the anti-Hitler elements in the military intelligence and had kept the Bonhoeffer family informed of Nazi atrocities from the early 1930s. For many years, Bonhoeffer did not get involved, acting only as a sounding board and conscience for those in the resistance. But by the time of the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, where Jews were tortured, close to 100 murdered, 30,000 deported to concentration camps, he had thrown in his lot with the conspirators. In early 1940, Danyani informed him that war with Europe was imminent. In August of 1940, when he was looking for a way to avoid the draft, he met at the house with Hans and a few key men in the conspiracy. They suggested he join military intelligence as a double agent and become a more active part in the resistance. This would keep him out of the war, but at the same time give him the chance to put his strong convictions about stopping Hitler into practice. He ended up taking their offer. Returning to the afternoon of the arrest, Knut said, Dietrich called the von Danyani residence. A strange voice answered. Right away, he knew that Hans had been arrested and they were searching his home, and they would come for him next. Not wanting to wake his parents from their afternoon nap, Knut continued, Bonhoeffer went next door to his sister Ursula Schleicher's house to explain what had happened. While she began preparing him a large meal, he returned to his attic room to destroy key papers, and he planted a letter, backdated to provide plausible deniability. Let me show you Bonhoeffer's room, said Knut as he moved towards the stairs. We climbed to the top. The attic room contained a bed, a striped rug, and some bookcases, Spartan like a monk's cell. My son Jonathan sat down in the chair. Dietrich wrote parts of his ethics at that desk, said Knut, as well as his essay After 10 Years, which provided the theological justification for his involvement in the conspiracy. After finishing it, he gave it to a few key friends and then hid a copy in the rafters to hide it from the Nazis. Motioning to the area in front of the bookcases, Newt said, right there was a cot was set up for his best friend, Eberhard Bethke, who was a frequent guest at the house. Dietrich and Eberhard would spend hours each day reading and talking about theology, the church, and what needed to be done to rid Germany of Hitler. After he had gotten his papers in order, Newt continued with his story, Bonhoeffer walked across the garden path to his sister's to eat his big last meal and to wait. Over those few hours, they must have discussed all the possibilities, all the things that could happen, where he might be taken, what charges would be brought against him, and whether the Gestapo would discover the conspiracy. Around 4 p.m., his father came over to tell him that 2 men were there to see him. He returned to his attic room. The Gestapo found the paper he had planted. Then they searched the rest of the room. As I walked around the attic, I wondered if Dietrich was worried about them finding his essay in the rafters. Who stands fast, he asks in this essay, only the man who is ready to sacrifice all when he is called to obedient and responsible action in faith in an exclusive allegiance to God. The responsible man who tries to make his whole life an answer to the question and call of God. Providentially, the Gestapo did not find the essay. They arrested him, cuffed him, and took him away. As we descended the stairs that afternoon, I realized that he had made this courageous decision to act, to resist the Nazi evil while surrounded by family and friends in the comfort of his home. Now on his way to prison with the ever-present threat of torture and execution hanging over him, would he be so courageous? When the black Mercedes arrived at Tegel Prison, located in the northwest section of Berlin, Bonhoeffer was taken to the reception area, processed, and then placed in the admission cell for the night. The staff was instructed not to talk with him, and the warden called him a scoundrel. The cell was bitter cold. The blankets smelled so foul he refused to use them, making the first night of sleep fitful as he tried to stay warm. He could hear prisoners being tortured, their screams penetrating his cell throughout the night. At dawn, a piece of bread was thrown into his cell. The next day, he was moved to another cell on the top floor of the prison where those on death row were being held. His door only opened for food. No one spoke to him. Separated from family and friends, he was utterly alone. For years, he had struggled with bouts of depression, and now he longed for home. Finally, 2 weeks later, when the prison officials discovered, to their chagrin, that he was the cousin of Berlin's military commander, Paul von Hesse, his conditions improved dramatically. No surprise. He was moved to a new cell on the first floor, a 7-by-10 room with a plank bed, a bench against the wall, and a chamber pot. His food rations improved, but he was still isolated, and he still continued long days where he was left alone in a cell to ponder and think about life. But he did not just sit around. As soon as the authorities returned his Bible, which they had confiscated on the first day, each day he rose early to pray, to sing the Psalms and read Scripture. He meditated on a verse of the Bible for 30 minutes. He interceded for others, lifting up his friends and relatives, his former students, some who were in prison or now in concentration camps. He prayed for the Jews who were suffering so much. He prayed for his new friends, both prisoners and guards at Tegel. His daily liturgy gave him strength. In spite of the isolation, the dark thoughts at night, the constant homesickness, and the fear of torture and execution, Bonhoeffer began to build a life in prison. For hours each day, he studied, wrote letters, and continued his scholarship. His strong, optimistic outlook began to win over many guards. Impressed by his strength through trial, his good cheer to all, the guards started to bring their own problems to him, looking for advice or wisdom from this famous prisoner. In return for his counsel, they, at great danger to themselves, smuggled out his letters to Bethke, which years later would bring them both great fame. Prisoners also sought his counsel, knowing that he was someone they could talk to, a person who would understand them. As one of the few people that truly cared for others in the prison, and not just for himself, fellow prisoners just wanted to be close to him. He was not only surviving in prison, but he was thriving. What was his secret? According to Paul Busing, one of Bonhoeffer's former seminary students, the secret was Finkenwalde. I first read Life Together while teaching English in China 2 decades ago. Our sending organization gave it to us to help us to learn to live in community. They must have had a lot of experience of teachers killing themselves killing each other after a few months. From the start, no other book challenged, inspired, or directed me into the reality of Christian community. It transformed the way I thought about others, and over the years, I have read it dozens of times. I've quoted it from the pulpit and used it for reading groups. And as I said, now I use it in the seminary classroom. In fact, we were in Germany in part to find Finkenwalde, the place of his illegal seminary that inspired him to write Life Together a few years later after. I wanted to see the location of the community whose vision had guided me as a pastor for years. But I was not under the illusion that my kids at their ages, 12, 10, 7, and 5, would have much interest in the books or the location. So we planned a trip to his house, as I just described, in the 4 places that he was incarcerated, stuff that they might find interesting. Of course, I too was interested in these places, but at the time I planned our itinerary 6 months earlier, I did not see any connection between these 2 stages of his life, the time of the illegal seminary and his life as a spy. But I was soon to be proved wrong. As gale force winds attempted to knock us off the road and dust and dirt pelted the side of our RV, we passed through dense forest of pine trees, piles of freshly cut logs stacked on the side of the road. An hour outside of Berlin, the forest opened up, revealing miles of beautiful, wide-open countryside, the horizon only broken by an occasional outcropping of trees, a barn, and the ever-present post and beam fences. It was the day after our visit to the Bonhoeffer house, and we were in search of Finkenwalde, a small town 130 kilometers northeast of Berlin, where the illegal seminary was located from 1935 to 1937. But before we could go to Finkenwalde, we needed to travel to Stettin, located 8 kilometers north of the seminary, to visit the Bonhoeffer Study Center. For the past 6 months, I had been trying to track down the address of the illegal seminary that had been demolished long ago after the war. No one, not even the director of the Bonhoeffer house in Berlin, could tell me the exact location. It's like looking for the Holy Grail. This was not a good sign, and not speaking a word of Polish, which is where it is now, over the Polish border, or German, I was not anxious to wander around Poland looking for it. I had emailed the study center numerous times asking for the seminary address, but never got a response. So I did the only smart thing, or dumb thing. I thought if we went there in person, we might be able to find it. It was my last shot. I also wanted to visit the study center in Stettin to talk with them about some new thoughts I was having about Finkenwalde and its relationship to Bonhoeffer's later years. With my kids homeschooling in the back of the RV and nothing but acres of beautiful countryside to look at, I began to rehearse what I was going to discuss at the study center. My mind drifted back to China, living in community with 2 other teachers and studying life together and trying to make our little community thrive. Bonhoeffer's vision, though hard to attain, inspired us. We were motivated by the fact that every morning he led his students in a 45-minute prayer service. First they read a psalm, and then they sung a hymn. They read more scripture. Then Bonhoeffer gave them a long pastoral prayer, followed by the Lord's Prayer and concluded by another verse from hymns. After breakfast, they individually meditated on a passage of scripture for 30 minutes. Following meditation, the rest of the day was filled with lectures, study time, sermon prep, and time for work. During the day, there was also time for soccer, chess, and conversation. Around 10 p.m., he led another 45-minute service, like a bookend on the day. God had the first and the last word of each day. I had read somewhere that in the first few months, many of the ordinants chafed under this new discipline. They did not see why it was valuable, thinking it was a waste of time. Matter of fact, my seminary students, I think, thought the first 30 minutes of our class was a waste because they just wanted to get to the hard stuff in the theology. They now will tell you a different story. Even the great Karl Barth, when he got word of it, accused Bonhoeffer's young friend of creating a seminary with the, quote, odor of a monastic eros and pathos, end quote. Bonhoeffer disagreed. He responded to Barth saying, quote, "The charge of legalism does not seem to fit at all. What is there legalistic in a Christian setting to work to learn what prayer is and in his spending a good deal of time in this learning?" Seems like a good thing for a pastor to learn how to do, he was saying. Part of what Barth objected to was what he perceived as an unhealthy individualism, students spending an inordinate amount of time alone in prayer, silent meditation. But as Bonhoeffer tried to make clear, this was just part of the new training and was anything but individualistic. Each new discipline was done within the context of the new community, shaping the individual to love God and others more. In his Life Together, written as a summary of the Finkenwalde experiment, he stressed the disciplines of holding one's tongue, meekness, listening, helpfulness, bearing with one another. One of the hardest disciplines at the seminary was the rule never to speak about another brother in his absence. Gossip was not allowed, and talking behind someone's back was prohibited. And wouldn't that be a great rule in most of our churches? It would completely transform how we love one another. They were learning to serve one another. Once a man has experienced the mercy of God, said Bonhoeffer in his life, he will henceforth aspire only to serve. They were even required to have a prayer partner to confess their sins. But as much as Bonhoeffer's vision for a new community inspired me, over the years I began to have some reservations. There was something about the community at Finkenwalde that did not sit well with me. It was not the disciplines of community life that bothered me. As an evangelical, I could just dismiss those or take them if I wanted. And I often did, or I didn't know what they were about. Just thought, well, okay, that doesn't fit here. I did not share Barth's concern, though there is always a temptation towards legalism. Rather, what bothered me was the isolation, the sense of retreat from the world, a new tribalism that bothered me. I mean, I'm a city guy. I train urban church planners, so what is he doing out there? So far away from the urban setting. It appeared too world-fleeing for me. And I always wondered if he had given up the experiment as a failure and joined the conspiracy out of a frustration with the church. I remember where I was when I began to think differently about Finkenwalde. I was sitting at my study desk in the basement of Wycliffe Hall in early 2011, doing some reading to prepare for our visit to Germany. I was reading Craig Slane's book, long out of print, Bonhoeffer as Martyr, when this paragraph jumped out at me. Bonhoeffer believed that it was possible for a community gathered on the basis of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is really the heart of his book, The Cost of Discipleship. Many of those chapters he was writing and delivering to his students in the illegal seminary, to provide the necessary ground for resistance against tyranny. The practices of dying to oneself in confession, meditation, and intercession produced openness to others and forged the kind of solidarity required for moral risk-taking. Bonhoeffer's Finkenwalde experiment was anything but a retreat. It was strength training for a moral crucible. End quote. I'd never thought of this before. Is it possible that Finkenwalde was not a retreat from the world, a hiding place from persecution, but a boot camp for engagement with the world? Slane contends that Bonhoeffer, as a strong Lutheran, emphasized the breach that takes place in the believer's life at the time of conversion and baptism. Bonhoeffer held strongly to justification and the need for the righteousness of Christ. In fact, if you read carefully, the whole beginning of Life Together explains the importance of justification for the believer and for community. The breach from the world, argues Bonhoeffer, needed to be continuously reinforced through teaching, theology, and the separateness of community. But this separateness was never the last word, or it would lead to a new type of tribalism. Along with the narrative of a new life rooted in justification, Finkenwalde stressed a ritual that shaped new habits of worship, love for other Christians, and the outsider, like the Jew, and the enemy, like the Nazis. It would also provide an antidote to cheap grace, the illness of faith that does not produce discipleship. Bonhoeffer wrote, "Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes." As Slane adds, being immersed in a Christian community, a tradition of seeing whose primary story is the gospel, is ethically formative, end quote. Finkenwalde, then, was not a pietistic detour in his life of resistance, but a place where daily the students were learning to die to themselves through meditation, confession, the Lord's Supper, and intercessory prayer for one another and for outsiders. For this reason, says Slane, Finkenwalde life was itself a ritual. I will admit I had never seen this before. I had focused on the experience, the oneness, the joy of community life. I mean, I'm an evangelical. It's a kumbaya moment, and it's a wonderful feeling when you read Life Together. But I had not realized that this experience had to be reinforced with ritual, with a new daily liturgy undergirded by the gospel to birth this new community. Individuals participating in this new ritual of community are shaped and they gain new habits in the process. These new habits help them direct the desire already implanted in us by the gospel to focus like a laser on the target of the kingdom of God and living all of our life in the shadow of the eternal. I had also never seen so clearly the connection between the new liturgy of Finkenwalde and faithful engagement with the world. In the liturgy of community, Bonhoeffer prepared the ordinance for service, to love their brothers and to love their world. And on many days, they would go out into the community and to pursue missional aspects to serve their neighbors and serve the local town. As Slane adds, I submit that Bonhoeffer's plan for a vita communis was akin to a laboratory for morality in the midst of a dying church and a dying culture. They were not retreating from the culture. They were learning to engage the world in a whole new way, a way that would not succumb to the power and influence of Nazism. And then to keep going, it became a kind of ritual liturgical resistance, says Slane, or perhaps even liturgical treason. As a church planner and pastor who struggled for 10 years to facilitate community in a church plant, I had attempted over and over again to inspire the vision for community with the big narrative of the gospel. And this was important. This was the first step. This is justification that brings us together. But so often it fell on deaf ears. What I did not understand was that it needed to be reinforced with a new ritual, a counter liturgy that encompassed the entire community. In fact, if I had seen the importance of ritual, a daily liturgy of worship and life to go along with the weekly corporate liturgy of the gospel, I might have seen more transformation of individuals and more engagement with the world around us, and that includes myself as well. It was an insight I had just missed, though I had read Life Together dozens of times. What I needed to have done was find a way to contextualize the ritual, the liturgy of Life Together for my congregation, to train them to participate daily in a liturgy of worship and life, both individually and corporately, that would focus their desire on the kingdom and not the liturgies of desire that come from the world around us. After 2.5 hours of driving, we finally crossed the Polish border deeper into the countryside of Pomerania, far removed from Berlin. My mind was brimming over with thoughts of Finkenwalde and the need for ritual liturgy to augment the narrative story of the gospel. I kept looking for Stettin. I still had not seen a house for miles. I wondered if anybody lived out here. I guess if you're going to do something illegal, in fact treasonous, this would be a good place to do it, far from the watchful eyes and ears of the SS. But being secretive was only one reason for the choice of the location. Bonhoeffer was convinced that the church succumbed to Hitler because its theology and life did not have the theological and moral resources to stand up to the Nazi ideology, which was a highly ritualized order. The flags, the banners, the music, the uniforms, parades, the large public gatherings of light and sound, the message of Aryan supremacy, all perfectly orchestrated to reshape the desire of the German people, focusing it on the 1,000-year reign. Hitler was not just after blind submission. He wanted to win the minds and the hearts of the German people. He wanted them to worship Germany, to glorify it, and most importantly, to revere him, the Führer. This was religious. This had everything to do with reshaping their desire. To counter this false liturgy, Bonhoeffer knew the church must begin a new kind of monasticism. That's his quote, new kind of, from him, that would mold pastors with a new kind of counter liturgy of worship and desire. And it had to be as vigorous and as strong and as structured and as powerful with the gospel at the center to be able to counter what the Nazis were doing. But to accomplish this, he needed more than the normal weekly seminary classes or 1 hour on Sunday. What was required was life in community with his students, shaping and molding them around a new liturgy. That is why just any location would not do. In fact, he had been offered a building in Berlin, and he turned it down. He wanted to get his students to a remote place for a new experiment in community without the distractions of the city. They would be set apart for a time, often 6 months, and in this time, learn how to re-engage the world, but this time in a different way. About 20 minutes inside the Polish border, we spotted signs for the city of Stettin. As we approached this edge of the city, devoid of trees and greenery, it felt windswept as if it were just a dust bowl. People along the street struggled to walk, bent over from the wind, sheltering their eyes from the dust. As we entered the core of the city, once a striking German city, it was run down as buildings had not been renovated since before the war. We stopped at a traffic signal. People looked up from inside their small cars, eyeing our large RV as conspicuous as a tank driving down a suburban neighborhood. After winding through city streets for another 5 minutes, we arrived in front of a large 3-story home, the Bonhoeffer Study Center. As I walked towards the house, it looked freshly painted and rehabbed in stark contrast to the rundown homes around it. Years earlier, a wealthy donor gave the house for the study of Bonhoeffer's work in Finkenwalde. I climbed the front steps to the entrance. I rang the bell. No answer. I rang it again. Nothing. It was Friday afternoon. It must have closed early, and with it, my last chance to find the location of the seminar, at least on this trip. I kicked myself, feeling pretty stupid and not very organized as an international traveler. I consoled myself with the knowledge that there was not even much to see. The seminary had been destroyed after the war, and now only a memorial plaque marked the spot. But I was sad not to have the chance to walk that hallowed ground with my family. And I was doubly disappointed not to be able to talk to these Bonhoeffer scholars about the connection between Finkenwalde and Bonhoeffer's time in prison. But honestly, by then, I was all but convinced that this new reading, at least new for me, was correct. Its life was ritual, a new liturgy rooted in the gospel of justification that produced people who knew what it was to die to themselves and to love and sacrifice for others, even those outside of the family of God. Unlike what I had thought 6 months earlier, there was a connection between Finkenwalde and his time in prison. The secret to his remarkable influence in prison was his experiment in community. Reluctantly, we began our drive back to Berlin. As we headed out of the city, the gale-force winds not letting up, I looked south in the direction of Finkenwalde and saw an outcropping of trees hiding a farmhouse. I was reminded of that fateful day in October 1937. With the term over and the students gone home, Bonhoeffer and Belcher went on vacation in the mountains for some much-needed rest. Unannounced, the Gestapo arrived at the house and shut down the seminary. The doors were sealed forever. Bonhoeffer's experiment in Christian community and pastoral training was over. But its impact in the midst of the storm would be felt for years, especially in the life of its director. As Bonhoeffer sat in his Tegel cell in July 1944, 7 years after the Gestapo closed the seminary, he pondered his escape. The plan was set in motion, but then something unexpected happened. The Gestapo arrested his brother Klaus. If Bonhoeffer escaped now, the Nazis would assume his brother Klaus was guilty, and they would round up the entire family, including his fiancée Maria. The Nazis would have no qualms about enslaving them all in concentration camps. But if he did not escape now, he knows he would be executed. He faced a moral dilemma, but in the end, the decision was an easy one for him. He would not put his family into that kind of jeopardy. He knew what he had to do, sacrifice his life for those he loved. His final idol, the fear of torture and death, he had to face. Alone in his cell, he must have thought of the words he wrote years earlier. Death is only dreadful for those who live in dread and fear of it. Death is not wild and terrible if only we can be still and hold fast to God's word. Death is not bitter if we have not become bitter ourselves. Death is grace, the greatest gift of grace that God gives people who believe in him. It beckons to us with heavenly power. If only we realize that it is the gateway to our homeland, the tabernacle of joy, the everlasting kingdom of peace. He wrote these words years earlier in the safety of his pastorate in London. Now these words meant something different. He owned them for real, and in the process he experienced a new freedom from the fear of death. Drawing on the resources of Finkenwalde, supported in prayer by his family and friends, his true homeland, the tabernacle of joy, the everlasting kingdom of peace, would lead him into the days ahead. 3 months after the failed Valkyrie assassination attempt, on Sunday, October 8, 1944, Bonhoeffer's year and a half at Tegel came to an abrupt end. He was moved across town to the Gestapo House prison, no longer under the watchful eye of his uncle, who had been hanged for his role in the July conspiracy. He was now in the grips of the Gestapo. Looking down into the bombed-out basement of the Gestapo prison, I now saw Dietrich's experience in prison in a different light. I saw it through the eyes of Finkenwalde. It is true he was here because of his involvement in the conspiracy. That was obvious. But his motivation to resist evil was forged in Finkenwalde. And the way he acted once he was in prison was shaped by the new liturgy of community, rooted in the gospel. Arriving at Prince Albrechtstrasse, Bonhoeffer discovered that the conditions were much worse than Tegel. He also learned that almost the entire leadership of the conspiracy was in prison with him. "It's hell in here," said Admiral Canaris, the former head of military intelligence and Bonhoeffer's friend. But Bonhoeffer remained content, drawing strength from his daily routine of scripture reading, meditation, prayer and adoration, supplication, intercession. Walking around the top perimeter of the cells, I recalled something I had read that morning in preparation for our visit. Quote, "He was always good-tempered," recounts Fabian von Schlabrendorf of his time with Bonhoeffer in the Gestapo prison. Quote, "Always of the same kindliness, politeness towards everyone, so that to my surprise, within a short time, he had won over his warders, who were not always kindly disposed. He always cheered me up and comforted me. He never tired of repeating that the only fight which is lost is that which we give up. Many little notes he slipped into my hands on which he had written biblical words of comfort and hope," end quote. No matter how dark things got in the basement prison, he always put the concern of others first and, quote, "acted as the appointed servant to the word of Jesus Christ," end quote. The next morning, we left Berlin and drove 5 hours south to Weimar in the Buchenwald concentration camp, nestled in the tree-covered hills overlooking the city. Just as an aside, the Germans had a great love of beautiful places, and they often put their concentration and work camps in places that they had visited prior on vacation with their families, because they figured if they've got to be stuck here for a long period of time, it might as well be beautiful. And you drive into these camps and you think you're first driving into a resort. And the houses that the SS lived in were often beautiful cottages, two-story homes. It was only when you got past the barbed wire that you saw the true reality. When we arrived, we went first to the information desk located in the part of the former Gestapo camp headquarters. I asked the man behind the counter where Bonhoeffer's cell was located. I was surprised that he knew right away. There must have been a lot of pilgrims, evangelicals no doubt, who had been there. He knew right away, taking out a map, encircling, he said, "Right here in the basement of the Gestapo barracks." It took us a few minutes to walk there, but just outside the camp, right where he said it was, we located the Gestapo barracks. All that remained was the basement. For 7 weeks, this was Bonhoeffer's home, 17 high-ranking members of the conspiracy who had been moved here when the Gestapo prison in Berlin was destroyed by air raids. They shared 12 cells in the dank basement, which formerly housed disobedient SS guards. Starting down the steps, we immediately saw at the bottom a silver plaque on the wall, giving testimony that Bonhoeffer and a few others in the conspiracy had indeed been there. After reading the inscription, we turned right and walked down the narrow hallway. It could not have been more than 30 feet long. On each side were 6 cells. When they were let out of their cells each day for exercise, the hallway was the only place the prisoners were allowed to go, and they had no natural light down there. 6 at a time could pace up and down the corridor to stretch their legs. During this time, they were able to talk and share information. Payne Best, an Englishman who shared a cell close to Bonhoeffer, later wrote, he was, quote, all humanity and sweetness. He always seemed to me to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy, in even the smallest events of life, and of a deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. He was one of the very few men that he had ever met whom God was real and close to. Best continues, Bonhoeffer's soul really shone in the dark desperation of our prison. He had always been afraid that he would not be strong enough to stand such a test, but now he knew there was nothing in life in which one need ever be afraid, end quote. Of course, Bonhoeffer had accepted death. He had learned at Finkenwalde to focus on the kingdom. His daily habits of devotion helped to keep his desire directed to the eternal. Knowing his destination, he overcame daily suffering and despair and was able to comfort others. The record shows that. By now, it was late in the afternoon, and it was time to leave. We still had a 3-hour drive in our RV ahead of us, needing to get to Flossenburg concentration camp before it got dark. As we drove south into the Bavarian mountains, the late afternoon sun streamed in the driver's compartment. And if you know how freezing cold it had been, I'm a Southern California guy, and freezing cold just to get some spring sunshine through the driver, you know, into the compartment as I'm driving was just heavenly. It was keeping me warm, and it was also putting me in a reflective mood. I began thinking about Bonhoeffer's last 6 days of life after he left Buchenwald. His true telos, his destination, his true homeland was calling him. Just then, to my surprise, coming through my German radio station, I heard Guns N' Roses singing Bob Dylan's song. Mama, take this badge off of me. I can't use it anymore. It's getting dark, too dark to see. I feel I'm knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. 5 days after leaving Buchenwald, late Sunday afternoon, Bonhoeffer was escorted by 2 guards through the main gates of Flossenburg concentration camp. That's the main gate. Spring had not arrived in the mountains of eastern central Germany, and a late afternoon chill had descended on the camp. He was led through Roll Call Square, then they turned right and walked past 3 barracks on the right and the sick bay on the left. At the far southern end of the camp, just inside the barbed wire fence, sat a long building called the Detention Barracks, comprised of a single row of cells. Special prisoners, mostly Russian and Polish officers, were executed here. In the final year of the war, 1,500 special prisoners were brutally murdered, their bodies burned on a massive funeral pyre, which you can see the memorial to it just down below the camp. As they entered the barracks, Bonhoeffer was escorted down the hall, watching as faces appeared in the 6x9 holes in the door. Among others, he recognized Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and General Hans Oster, who along with Bonhoeffer were part of the failed plots to assassinate Hitler. The guard shoved Bonhoeffer into an open cell and locked the door. He was tired and hungry. He sat down on the edge of his bed and prayed for strength, for him and for the other prisoners awaiting death. Just then, his train of thought was broken. A door down the hall swung open. The guards removed General Oster. 30 minutes later, they brought him back. Then it was Admiral Canaris's turn. What was going on? Over the course of the evening, guards removed each member of the conspirators one by one. Hitler had sent a judge hundreds of miles to quickly set up a summary court to try the conspirators. But it was a mock court. The verdicts already handed down by Hitler, the final arbiter of justice in the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer was tried last. When he got back to his cell around 2 a.m., he fell asleep quickly. He did not sleep long. At 5 a.m., a guard unlocked the door and unlocked and kicked open his door. "Get up and undress," he growled. "Where am I being taken?" Bonhoeffer asked. "To hear the verdict," the guard said. The guard walked to the next cell, leaving Bonhoeffer to undress. Before doing so, he kneeled down in front of his bed, bowed his head, and he began to pray. We stood near the spot just out the barracks where on April 9th, the judge read the verdicts and pronounced the sentence. death by hanging. Looking down at the ground pensively, Herbert Sorgel, a local pastor and our Flossenburg guide, turned to look at the plaque on the wall and the newly placed flowers marking the anniversaries of the deaths just 2 days before. He himself had led the memorial service. I asked him what Dietrich might have prayed that last time as he kneeled before his place of execution. I can't be sure, Pastor Sorgel said. Maybe he was thanking God, grateful that he had given him the strength to make it to the end. Herbert's countenance then brightened and he asked me, "Do you remember his last letter to Maria?" "I do not," I said with some embarrassment. "Well, it contains a clue to how Dietrich managed to survive faithfully to the end. It may also be a clue to what he prayed that last time before he went to his death. In it, he says, 'I have not felt lonely or abandoned for a moment,' he said. 'You, your parents, all of you, the friends and the students of mine at the front, all are constantly present to me. It is a great invisible sphere in which one lives, in whose reality there is no doubt. It says in the old children's song about angels, 'Two to cover me, two to wake me.'" For Bonhoeffer, said Herbert, the people in his life were angels who were constantly with him, even at the moment of his death. It is they, his family, his Finkenwalde community, rooted in the grace of Christ, whom were with him right to the end. This was his secret. It was the secret he learned in Finkenwalde, forged by a new liturgy of Christian community. As I turned to look at the spot of the execution, I imagined Bonhoeffer slowly climbing the steps to the gallows. As I turned to look at the spot of execution, I imagined, I wrote that twice. Did he think of his words from the poem, I asked myself, the poem Stations on the Road to Freedom? "Come now, death, highest feast on the way to everlasting freedom. Lay waste the burdens of chains and walls which confine our earthly bodies, in blinded souls that we see at last what we could not see." End quote. The noose was put around Bonhoeffer's neck. Death came in seconds. He was free, free to see the face of God, free to enter the kingdom of everlasting peace. In almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, said the Flossenburg camp physician years later, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. Amen.